numbers of candles on the table, while standing in buckets of water, calling up and down 3 or 7 stairs from the front hallway. Mora called it continuing education. Calla called it turning tricks. Persephone called it that thing we could do if there's nothing on television. That day, after the teens had left the house, the women abandoned work and set up the game in the shabby but comfortable living room.
I'm not nearly drunk enough to be transcendent,
Calla said after a space. She was not the only psychic drinking, but she was the closest one to transcendence. Persephone peered dubiously into the bottom of her own glass. In a very small voice, her voice was always small, she said sadly,
I'm not drunk at all.
Mora offered, it's the Russian in you.
Estonian.
At that moment, the doorbell rang. Mora swore delicately, one well-chosen and highly specific word. Calla swore indelicately, several more words with rather fewer syllables. Then Mora went for the front door and reappeared with a tall man. He was very gray. He wore a dark gray V-neck t-shirt that emphasized the muscular slope to his shoulders. His slacks were a deeper gray. His hair was an ashy blonde, drained of color, and so was the fashionable week-old facial hair around his mouth. Even his irises were gray. It escaped none of the women in the room that he was handsome. This is Mr. Gray. All of the women's mouths twisted into a knowing kind of smile. Mora said, he wanted a reading.
We're closed.
Calla is rude. We're not close, but we are busy.
This was said with a question in her voice and an anxious glance towards Mora. That's what I told him, Mora said. However, it turns out that Mr. Gray doesn't really need a reading. He's a novelist, researching psychics. He just wants to observe. Calla rattled the ice in her glass. One of her eyebrows looked exceptionally skeptical.
What do you write, Mr. Gray?
He smiled easily at her. They noticed he had extraordinarily straight teeth.
Thrillers. Do you read much?
She merely hissed and tipped her glass toward him, plum lip mark first. Do you mind if he stays? He knows poetry. Without the slightest hesitation or suggestion of self-consciousness, the gray man placed his hands in the pockets of his dark gray slacks and said,
Where has gone the steed? Where has gone the youth? Where has gone the giver of treasure? Where are the feasting seats? Where the revelry in the hall? Alas, bright goblet! Alas, mailed warrior! Alas, prince's glory! How that time has passed away, obscured beneath the crown of night as if it never were.
Calla lifted her lips from her teeth.
Do it in the original Old English and I'll put alcohol in that drink.
He did. Calla went to get him a drink. After she had returned and the gray man had been encouraged to sit on the worn couch, Mora said, I'll warn you that if you try anything, Calla has mace. By way of demonstration, Calla handed him his drink and removed a small black container of pepper spray from her small red purse. Mora gestured towards the third member of her group. And Persephone is Russian.
Estonian.
And Mora made an extremely convincing fist. I know how to punch a man's nose into his brain.
What a coincidence. So do I.
He watched with an attentiveness both polite and flattering as Mora scraped her cards up from the sofa cushions. He leaned to pick up one she had missed.
This fellow looks unhappy.
The art depicted a man stuck with 10 swords. The victim lay on his face, as most people did after being stuck with 10 swords. That's a fellow after Calla's done with him, Mora said. Good news for him is that the 10s represent the end of a cycle. This card represents the absolute worst he'll get.
Does seem like there's not much worse than 10 points in your back and dust in your mouth.
Look, his face looks a little like yours. The gray man studied the card. He placed his finger on the blade rammed through the victim's back.
And that sword looks a little like you.
He glanced at Mora. It was a glance. She glanced back. It was also a glance. Would you do the honor, Mr. Gray? Mora handed him the deck of cards. You'll have to ask, top or bottom? Mr. Gray gravely accepted the responsibility. He asked Calla, top or bottom?
3 of cups. And top, of course. The only place to be.
Mr. Gray removed the card from the top and turned it over. Of course it was the 3 of cups. Mora grinned. Empress, bottom. The gray man removed the card from the bottom and showed it to the room. The Empress's gown was suggested with a liberal swipe of charcoal, and her crown was studded with inky fruits or jewels. The gray man clapped slowly.
4 wands, bottom.
10 of coins, top.
Ace of cups, bottom.
10 of... what? The sun's bottom.
4 of swords, top.
The gray man flipped the cards again and again, revealing the correct predictions. Persephone's quiet voice cut through Mora's and Cala's increasingly loud competition.
The King of Swords.
Everyone turned to look at Persephone, who sat with her knees together and her hands folded neatly in her lap. Occasionally, Persephone appeared both 8 years old and 80 at once. Now was one of those times. The gray man's hand hovered obediently over the deck.
Top or bottom?
16 cards from the top, I believe.
Mora and Cala both raised an eyebrow. Cala's went up farther. The gray man carefully counted the cards, double-checked his count, and then turned over the 16th card for the others to see. The King of Swords, master of his own emotions, master of his own intellect, master of reason, gazed out at them, expression inscrutable.
That's Mr. Gray's card.
Sure. At a wordless agreement from Persephone, Mora turned to the gray man. Do you think that's your card? The gray man turned the card one way and another, as if it would reveal its secrets to him.
I don't know much about tarot. Is it a terrible card?
No card is a terrible card. She eyed the gray man, fitting the King of Swords into the man before her. And the interpretation can be very different at each reading. But the King of Swords is a powerful card. He's strong but impartial. Cold. He's very, very good about making decisions based upon facts instead of emotion. No, it's not a terrible card, but I'm picking up something else off it. Something like violence. It was a word that had an immediate effect on everyone in the room. Yes, violence. Is that what you meant, Persephone? Yes. All three of them had leaned unconsciously toward one another. Sometimes Mora, Persephone, and Cala seemed more like 3 parts of the same entity instead of 3 separate women. The 3 of them turned as one to Mr. Gray.
My work is sometimes violent.
I thought you said you were researching a novel.
That was a lie. I'm sorry. I had to think quickly when you said I couldn't have a reading.
So what's the truth?
I'm a hitman.
This confession ushered in several moments of silence. The gray man's answer seemed very flippant, but his voice suggested otherwise. It was the sort of answer that required an immediate clarification or qualification, but he offered nothing. That's not very funny.
No, it's not.
Everyone in the room was waiting for Mora's response. She asked, "And does work bring you here tonight?"
Just for search.
For work?
Everything is research for work, in its way.
He did absolutely nothing to make his words easier to accept. It was impossible to tell if he was asking them to believe him, or to humor him, or fear him. He merely laid out his confession and waited. Finally, Mora said, "Might be nicer to have someone deadlier than Cala in the room for a change." She glanced at him. He glanced back. There was a wordless, tacit agreement in it. They all had another drink. The gray man asked knowledgeable questions full of wry humor. Sometime later, he stood, took everyone's empty glasses to the kitchen, and excused himself with a glance at his watch.
Not that I wouldn't like to stay.
Then he asked if he could return later in the week. And Mora said yes. After he had gone, Cala looked through his wallet, which she had stolen as he left.
The ID is fake.
She closed the billfold and stuffed it into the couch cushions where he had been sitting.
We don't miss his credit cards. Why did you ever say yes?
Something like that makes me feel better if I can keep my eye on it.
Oh, I think we all know what you're keeping your eye on.
Well done.